amazing. I think in the interest of time, we will continue the practice of having people ask questions and talk with the speakers during the breaks. And Anand, I think we'll be happy to talk with anyone. Our next speaker is again someone I've known quite a while, Sacha Vignieri. Sacha was an undergraduate here as well, got her degree in integrative biology. She took 104 in 1992. She then went on to get a PhD at the University of Washington with Jim Carnegie, who's both an NBC friend and was curator at the Burke Museum there, so the Burke theme, studying mammalogy and mammals, so all good there. She went on to postdoc. The coefficient of inbreeding in this room is pretty darn high. Among the postdoc positions had, Sacha did a postdoc with Hopi, who's here somewhere in the room, back there. Before again taking a little bit of a different career trajectory that emphasizes more the connection between natural history and science and communication. Sacha is now a rather senior editor at a little-known publication called Science. So she's going to talk to us today, I think, about some of the interface between natural history and that particular outlet for communicating science. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eileen. It's so wonderful to be here, to see all these friendly faces. It's just a real pleasure. Some of you might be wondering what that title is about. So this is an example of when you do something you tell other people not to do, which is to make a really catchy title that has no bearing whatsoever on the content. So young children love nature. They love animals. Their minds are primed to learn about the world around them. Their hearts are primed to love it. It's just a natural, innate thing. This is my son communing with a western fence lizard when he was 4. He still communes with whatever animal he can get his hands on. And as evidenced by his parents, this is something that transcends generations. When you're a child, you don't really know why you love nature, you just know you do. And evolutionary explanations for this abound. But fundamentally, it just is, the truth is, we just love nature as children. And we actually have to unlearn our love and affinity for nature. And these days, there are plenty of things that help us do this, lots and lots of distractions. So the NIH reports that the average time the American child spends in front of a screen is 7 hours a day. A day. So this takes children inside, away from nature. It reduces their attention span, and it trains their brains to expect the world to occur at a more rapid pace than it actually does. Research shows that it actually even rewires the brain. But what's interesting about this phenomenon is that even though children are becoming more and more disconnected from nature, their drive to actually name and connect with the world around them remains. It's just shifted. So in 2002, Andrew Bamford and colleagues were interested in determining how many animals that are around them British children could identify. And they found that young children are actually quite good at identifying animals, given their age. And that this increased as they aged. They were able to identify the animals that they saw around them pretty well. But this was eclipsed as they aged by their ability to recognize another increasingly popular, or maybe persistently popular, stand-in for nature, Pokemon. So what you can see is that their ability to recognize regular animals kind of peaks a little bit and then declines, whereas their ability to recognize Pokemon actually peaks, also declines, which may reflect even a further shift away from sort of a connection to anything that has to do with nature. And as Pokemon Go has shown us since that time, people actually have a real drive to get things on their life list. This is a real thing. People die to try to get Pokemon sightings. However, there's unfortunately no connection to nature when they do this. They have no affinity or interest in the world around them. This is a bunch of people at a Pokemon, I don't even know what these are called, sites. What? Great. Okay. So what you can see is that I don't think there's up at the park around them. They're all looking at their screens. But so what this does tell us is that even though modern society is distracting us from the natural world, we still have a desire to connect with the other. And so what we need is for natural history to come and rescue us again, because we still want this. We just have become very much turned inward. But those of us in this room were some of the lucky ones in terms of being able to maintain a connection with nature. We had a spark somewhere in our lives that drew us to nature, and then we were somewhere where we could actually nurture that spark with a course in natural history. I took this class, as I mentioned, in 1992, but I actually was really lucky in that Jim Patton let me take mammalogy first because I had transferred. So for me, this was actually my second exposure to natural history in this way rather than my first. But either way, this course really allowed for us to transfer or transmit or transform our love for nature into something that was a real scientific pursuit. When I took this course, I loved animals, and I thought that was going to take me into a veterinary career. I had no idea you could even have a natural history-based scientific career. And many of the other students in this course had no idea either. Many of them were headed to medical school, as has already been discussed, due to a requirement. And so we weren't headed this direction, but many of us left, headed that direction when we were finished. And of course, no memory of this course would be complete without discussing the wonderful instructors, who of course have already been discussed many times. But I just can't say enough how much these people inspired all of us. And it was their clear love for their work, the animals and the environments that we were in, that really showed us how wonderful this kind of work can be, and developed a real camaraderie. I think it was, maybe, I can't remember now who said it, but somebody earlier today said that it was the first time they'd seen professors as people, and that was definitely my experience too. So along the lines of having wonderful professors, this course also attracted a really wonderful cohort of students, as has also sort of been mentioned today. And many of us developed just an amazing camaraderie, likely because of our time in the field. But if you look at the website, some of the stories and remembrances, you can see lots of fun stories, jokes, and I think each cohort has their own sort of memory list of this, and I'm just going to go through a couple of mine. So a lot of these had to do with ways that we remember the species that we were supposed to be learning. So this is the Slender salamander, right? And what we did with this species is anytime we saw this anywhere, we yelled, "Slender!" as loud as we could. And it helped us all identify more and more of these, figure out where they were. Another one was making up really catchy names that we could remember. This is an all-excited flycatcher. We call it all-excited flycatcher, and something I still think of every time I see any kind of flycatcher. Another one was kind of funny, but we used to give a particular archetype to certain species, and there wasn't really any reason for this. But so this is a California thrasher, and for some reason we always thought of this as a surfer. So we would always walk around, "This is a California thrasher, dude." So anyway, these are just stories and memories of sort of what made this course, from a, sort of a social perspective, so wonderful. And of course, the learning was amazing. And so many of us left with this just great inspiration to follow this path and pursue this kind of science for our careers. And so off to the field we went, or off to graduate school that would take us into the field with our field notebooks in tow. I tried to find my field notebook, and I think I have it, but I couldn't find it. So instead I found all these beautiful examples online, which are much more beautiful than mine. But so headed off to grad school, but many of us were in for a big shock when we went to grad school. So when I went to grad school, which is right around here, funding for natural history research and funding for natural history education followed a trajectory that had started many decades earlier and really bottomed out. And there just wasn't any funding for this kind of research. And so we were kind of stuck in the lurch. And we were in a situation where research had become much more reductionist. Technology had led towards molecular and cellular developments, which were great, but also took a lot of funding away from the kind of research we had gone to do. And so we've talked a lot today. Many people have discussed what the impacts of this kind of loss were, and the value of natural history education from an educational perspective. But what I want to talk about a little bit is what this loss or decline has done to the science. So reductionism is where we look at the parts of each thing, and we look in great detail at the parts of each thing. And the idea is that if we look at the parts of each thing and we understand how each of these parts work in great detail, then we can understand the whole. But doing this is like studying the cog within a gear wheel within a car. So we might know vast amounts of information about that cog. But unless we understand that the cog is in a gear wheel, and the gear wheel is a car, and the car is an organism that functions in a particular way, we have no idea what the gear wheel or cog are for, or why they're important in any way. And so reductionism has value, but the idea that we can study each of the parts is perhaps misleading. And so in some cases, in a car, we might get close, right? But in other systems, this is not the case. So what about here in starling enumeration? You think we can study each of those starlings and come up with why they form these beautiful things in the sky? Or here, where these patterns form out in the desert, and we still don't know exactly why. We've come up with lots of explanations, termites, plants, different water patterns. We still don't know. Or here, right, where we can look in the brain and we can see all kinds of neurons and firing patterns, and we can study what parts of the brain do what, but can we really characterize a human being? So, in 1966, Francis Crick said that the ultimate aim of the modern movement in biology is to explain all biology in terms of physics and chemistry. And so this kind of motivation led decades of decline in natural history and an increase in reductionism. And so now we kind of are in a stage where we've had that experience, but now we really know that we can't do that, right? We know that biological systems have emergent properties that cannot be defined by the sum of their parts. And so in all biological systems, even this one, or maybe especially this one, we have to think more in a more whole organism way. And so maybe some of you are saying, maybe not in this audience, but a lot of people might be saying, what's wrong with technology and mechanism? So we have learned a ton about about mechanism. And technology is important, and many people in this room have done a great job of combining the two. And so that's what I want to argue will actually save natural history, and will actually save, I think, science on the whole from going down certain paths that might not be that informative for us. So now that we know that reductionism is not a pure answer, we can return to the idea that we can be more holistic in the way that we look at research. And by shifting our research questions so that we're looking at the whole, instead of just the parts, we can really begin to return to an approach that many people in this room are using, where we apply technology and specific new methodologies, and we look at mechanism, and we break things down. But nonetheless, we retain a sense of the whole. And so I want to just give you an example. I decided to do this by just looking in the last 2 weeks of science and picking a paper that I thought demonstrated how we can do this and the way forward. So this is a Hadza warrior up there. And what I want to just do is go through sort of the steps of how natural history knowledge can really, or is actually essential in our understanding of patterns and scientific questions. So if we look first, just to give you some background, what the researchers here were looking at is the microbiota, the gut microbiota of the Hadza people. So what they did is they used technological advances to identify the abundance and ratios of microbiota within the gut. And if we just look at a snapshot, so if we just look at the sample, we can see ratios, the various phyla that are in the gut, and that gives us some pretty interesting information, right? We know that within this gut, this exists. Okay, that's almost no natural. That's just a sample. That's a reductionist point. So if we add a little bit of natural history and we look across seasons, we can see how these vary. So we can see that so this is a dry season, a wet season. You can see that some of these go up, some go down across the time. So now we know a little bit more. We know there's seasonal variation. And if we look a little bit more and we compare, this is the human microbiome project. So this is a sample of modern society living people, and this is the Hadza. And if we compare these two samples, so now we're not just looking at a single group, we've started to do some comparison, we can see that the samples look pretty similar. This is sort of the variation in terms of the kinds of microbiota that are in the gut. And we might conclude, actually, based on this information, that the Hadza samples, or the Hadza gut microbiota, is actually pretty similar to those people living in modern societies. And so some people might stop there and say, you know, it's interesting because our modern society guts are pretty similar to those of traditional living people. But if we did that, we'd be making a big mistake. Because in fact, if we then look again across season, what we can see is that that's only true in the wet season. In the dry season, their gut microbiota is actually very different. And so had we stopped here with just a little bit of natural history, we would have made a mistaken conclusion. Now if we go to this next level, we not only don't make that mistaken conclusion, but now we see some really interesting patterns. So why are those different? We saw that there was some seasonal variation. So now we get a little bit more natural history information. And we find out that in the dry season, the Hadza eat a lot of plants. And in the wet season, the Hadza eat a lot of animals. And so now we know that there's variation in the gut microbiota based on diet. And we also know, by looking at this comparison, that the animal-based microbiota is pretty similar to Western societies, suggesting that Western societies probably eat less plant material than the Hadza do. And now we have a new research question. We can actually go out and we can test this. And so the point in demonstrating this is to show just how much value there is in this kind of research when we actually integrate natural history. And I can tell you that most microbiome research does not integrate natural history, especially when it's on humans. And so what's nice about this study, though, is that it came out in 2017. And so there's natural history to the rescue yet again. It increases our understanding, as we've seen. But this study coming out in 2017 also gives us hope. And so we can see now that there is maybe a little bit of a swing in the pendulum backwards towards integrating more natural history. And I can tell you that I see this a lot, more often now than even when I started at Science 7 years ago. And I hear it from funders. So there are lots of arguments for why we need to be thinking about whole organism research and understanding natural history. And so I think what we need to do is realize that it is appreciated more and more, the value of understanding how organisms operate in their environments. And that example that I give, one might argue it'd be pretty easy to integrate natural history. If you're studying traditional societies, you can easily go out and collect information about their diet. But I would argue that actually every study that you do, no matter how reductionist, you could add, or one could add, some natural history information. And it's actually really essential, I think, now more than ever, that natural history information is reintegrated into science. And this is not just for science's sake, this is for the general public. The general public sees what we do, they see in the news what's reported, what's highlighted, and mostly what's highlighted in the news, even about science, is us. So we navel gaze all the time in society. Everything we see, hear, read, for the most part, and especially the general public that is outside of this room, is about humans. And so it's not hard to see why the general public doesn't have a lot of empathy for species that are not themselves, because they don't understand them. And so in a quote that I first saw Harry Green present 20-some years ago, it's true that humans, we protect what we love. It's just the way we are. And we love what we know. And so now more than ever, we need to, as scientists and as citizens, make sure that everybody understands the world around them and understands why we should love the world around them and understands why we should hope for the world around us. And so it's on us. It's our responsibility. So thank you, and get out there.